is my pleasure to present to some and introduce to others, Tracey Travis. Tracey has had an extraordinary career across finance, strategy, and corporate leadership. She most recently served as the Chief Financial Officer at the Estée Lauder companies, helping guide one of the world's most influential beauty companies through a period of global growth and transformation. Today, she continues to influence and shape the future of business as a board director for organizations including Meta, Accenture, and Hyatt Hotels. She's also a proud alumna of Columbia Business School, and during my time as a second year, I had the opportunity to have a one-on-one with her where she dropped some gems. So it's especially meaningful to welcome her back to this community today. Tracey, welcome.
Thank you.
So glad to have you here.
It's good to be here. It is so good to be back at Elevate. Everybody looks fantastic. So it is great to be in this room.
Beautiful. Okay, so we're going to kick off with the first question. We'll start with just your career journey. So you began your career in engineering before pivoting into finance and eventually becoming CFO at one of the world's most influential beauty companies. What experiences early on in your journey shaped how you approach leadership today? And how did you think about building a career around a functional expertise like finance versus an industry-specific one?
Yeah. No, thank you for the question. I'd love to say that there was a master plan in terms of how I thought about my career starting in engineering. There was not. So for those of you, still trying to figure out, what you will do once you graduate from CBS, I think, my career journey is a testament to it will work out, and you can build some great experiences along the way. So I did start my career as an engineer. I studied industrial engineering in undergrad, went to work for General Motors. At the time, GM was the Fortune 1 company in the Fortune 500. And I worked for them as a reliability engineer. So really writing process specs for new products. So put a pin in that. Really working a lot with the workers in the plant, and with the engineering organizations, et cetera. Came to Columbia thinking that, at some point I wanted to run a big operating environment, manufacturing operating environment. So took operations management courses. Hopefully some of you are taking some of those courses, but also took a finance course and fell in love with finance and decided to do a double concentration here at Columbia. Went back to General Motors in finance roles, but working with engineers to actually launch new products in international markets. So I got to leverage my engineering experience, but also, really get exposure to international markets and learn, some of the complexities of operating in international markets, some of the opportunities that existed for growth in international markets. And that was one of the pivotal experiences that certainly influenced my career down the road. When you're in automotive, and maybe some of you came from automotive, I spent about 5 years in total. The product life cycle is quite long. So when you're in new products and a new product gets improved, 4 to 5 years later, at that time, at least, the product comes to market. And so right around 5 years since I had been there, I was approached by Pepsi. And Pepsi was a fast-paced consumer products company. Their motto at the time and what they were known for was ready, fire, aim. And that kind of an environment really appealed to me. It was a very younger company, performance-driven. And so I spent 10 years at Pepsi, 6 years in finance and strategy roles, and then 4 years in a general manager role. And I would say some of the experiences I had at Pepsi were incredibly influential in terms of my future career and how I led. In the strategy role, again, I had worked on new products at General Motors in both engineering as well as finance. One of my roles at Pepsi, I was in the strategy group and working with them on new products. So they had decided that they needed to diversify their beverage portfolio and not just focus on soft drinks. And so the role that I was in was group manager of new products. And I worked with them to try to figure out, should we enter the juice category, the tea category, the water category, Aquafina. And so I worked with the marketing team on putting together the business plans for how we might actually enter those markets, whether it be through joint venture, which in some cases we did, partnership agreements, or launching on their own, which is what was done with Aquafina. So that was really wonderful. I went back and did a divisional CFO role with them. And then I was, and I always say this was my put your money where your mouth is role. I was tapped at the time to be a general manager. So I had been partnering with general managers to drive business results. And then I was asked, do you want to be a general manager of a market with the bottling organization? And so, I've often said that this was my riskiest move, but also my most rewarding career experience because, up to that point, I had been doing a lot of strategy and analytical work. It was the opportunity to have a broader leadership role, manage day-to-day execution, get the trucks out, get the product delivered, deal with customers. I went from managing a group of 10 people to managing a group of 400 across multiple facilities. And it was an exponential learning experience. It was risky because the market unit was one of the worst performing in the Pepsi bottling system. So I had to think about, I had never done, even though I had an engineering background, I had never done an operating role before. And there was a high risk of failure. But fortunately, leveraging, some of the background and experience, we actually turned the market unit around and it became one of the best performing market units in the Pepsi system. So by that time, I had had the opportunity to have engineering experience, operating experience. I was managing a plant and a distribution center and a sales organization. I left Pepsi after 10 years and went briefly to a company called American National Can, where I had the opportunity. They were owned by a French company, had the opportunity to help them do an IPO. And I was there for a couple of years. And then I was tapped by Limited Brands. And they were looking for a public company CFO of a company called Intimate Brands, which was Victoria's Secret and Bath & Body Works at the time. And I had never thought about retail. Obviously, my background up to that point had been automotive and consumer products. But I decided that it was quite interesting in terms of, exploring a different industry, and certainly with the background that I had acquired up to that point. And so I did. The Limited at that time had, 7 different retail formats, including some of the apparel brands. And I worked first with Victoria's Secret and Bath & Body Works, and then became responsible for the other apparel brands as well from a finance standpoint, which was great experience. Someone I had worked with at Estée Lauder, not Estée Lauder, at Limited Brands, went to Ralph Lauren and asked me if I would be interested in coming to Ralph Lauren. They were looking for a CFO that had retail experience, that had M&A experience, and because they were really looking to build out their brand portfolio. They had licensed a lot of their product categories and geographies. Yeah. And obviously with the M&A experience I had at General Motors and the retail experience I brought from the Limited, I decided to make that move. And so I was the CFO at Ralph Lauren for 7 years. I turned 50. And so there are these pivotal moments in your life where you think, what do I want to do for my next chapter? And recognizing that in apparel and just given the nature of the business, I was never going to be the CEO. I didn't have the merchant experience, the brand experience at Ralph Lauren. And I was approached by Estée Lauder. Ralph Lauren obviously being a mono-brand company. Estée Lauder was a multi-brand company. Yes. In beauty, and so I decided to join Estée Lauder. And the role that I had at Estée Lauder was finance, IT, strategy, transformation. So it was the broadest role of the CFO roles that I had. So I brought a lot of the experiences, that I gained in some of those other roles, certainly to Estée Lauder, including the M&A experience as well, which was fantastic. I learned through that journey, not only the benefit of getting a broad experience, leading up to a senior role, but it also helped me be more strategic. I also learned the importance of talent and having the right people working for you, mentoring and grooming the right talent. And those are some of the characteristics that I brought into the CFO role, and I think, allowed me to have the kind of career that I did. So,
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing.
yes.
I'm like, maybe I should think about pivoting, but maybe not. But lots of learning, I feel like lots of learning that you shared just from each role again. Okay. So when we think about that, and just thinking about working in this space, right? I'll transition over to think about consumer behavior.
Mhm.
So we know that within beauty, consumer behavior is increasingly shaped by technology, cultural shifts, and also the competition from indie brands, which we've spoken about. How do you think about integrating innovation into a legacy business model without compromising brand equity or financial discipline?
That is the question of the day still. So when I joined Estee Lauder, it was 14 years ago, and and we were talking a little bit earlier just about how quickly the beauty space has changed. When I joined Estee Lauder, advertising was still largely traditional advertising, print, television. There were only a couple of brands that actually did print and television advertising. And then the rest of the advertising was in store. I mean, it was really, the counters, the store formats, et cetera. Fast forward to today, and throughout that journey, and very quickly, traditional advertising changed to digital advertising. All brands needed the ability to be able to communicate to consumers, via social media. Um, the barriers to entry in the category came down, so a lot of indie brands were able to really focus on a few subcategories versus the broad assortments that the legacy brands had, the broad distribution that legacy brands had, and actually could focus on a subcategory, launching online with an influencer, getting traction, then expanding into specialty multi channels of distribution, and really gaining a lot of traction. So the space became much more crowded. Their business model was faster to market than a vertically integrated legacy brand. So we needed to really figure out how to pivot fast. Did a lot of work internally to really figure out if you are using an influencer and talking from a social media standpoint about your brand, you need to have a very clear brand message. It's not enough to just have a supermodel representing your brand without being able to communicate what the benefits of the brand are, being able to relate from a cultural standpoint to different audiences. So those were things that our legacy brands, and we had 24 around this time, somewhere between 20 and 26 during my tenure there. They all had to figure out, brand purpose, brand identity, and how to communicate that to consumers. And there was always this reluctance and concern, which we had to get over, about actually a different type of communication and whether or not you were positioning yourself as a luxury and prestige brand. And so lot of work and a lot of intelligence going on in terms of really figuring out how to actually sharpen the brand positioning for the various brands that we had. So it's tricky.
Yeah.
But I think, we certainly, there were talent implications associated with that in terms of making sure that you have people in your organization that could actually interact and communicate. We had to do much more in terms of marketing to different consumer groups because consumers expected something very different in terms of the messaging from brands. So I think, that became incredibly important: equity marketing and consumer reach marketing. And one of the things that we tried to keep the organization focused on, and our CEO was really very good at this, was focusing on trial versus repeat. So you have to play the game in terms of trial, because that's where the indie brands are getting a lot of trial, and consumers are really enjoying, discovery and experimentation with various brands, and innovation. The innovation cycle. There's a new product coming out every day. There are thousands of indie brands. But the focus that legacy companies like Estée Lauder, L'Oreal, Shiseido have on quality is important, because where the economics in the industry is in repeat, not in trial. And so you want to make sure, just given the investment that you're making in R&D and in distribution and in advertising, that once someone tries your product, they're actually going to repeat. And that's really where the economics are. So keeping the organization focused on that was important. And then the last thing I'll say about innovation is, we had to learn as an organization that innovation is not just product innovation, it's marketing innovation. So when you think about a brand like Estée Lauder or Clinique or MAC, they had broad assortments, much broader than a lot of the indie brands. And there were a lot of products within their assortment that you could animate differently from a marketing standpoint and get traction. And the example that we used over and over again with the investor community was the Clinique Black Honey lipstick.
Oh, yes.
That is a product that is 30 years old. And actually, it was by accident. The company did not pay an influencer initially to talk about this product. But someone went on social media, very convincing young lady, and talked about this product and how fabulous it was. And it went viral. And all of a sudden, we sold out in every distribution. And the thing about social media is, not only did it sell out in the US, because the influencer was in the US, but it sold out in other markets as well. And then we replenished, and it sold out again. And we replenished, and it sold out again. And so the brand obviously, then started to really figure out how can we leverage this, and not just from a forecasting standpoint, but also from a marketing standpoint to keep the momentum going, because it was a high quality product. And again, legacy companies have a lot of high quality products within their portfolio. They haven't necessarily animated them in a way that actually resonates with consumers today. So that balance, we spend a lot of time with our brands from a strategy standpoint, determining how much should we rely on product innovation versus how much should we actually rely on marketing innovation for our existing products to get profitable growth. So much more, I would say, complex than historically, but it was a really good time for the finance organization to lean in, along with the strategy organization, and help the company really figure out how to, the right balance that really, from an economic standpoint, worked out.
Yes, you spoke about that. Black Honey Clinique. As someone in my role, I report on just the industry and what we're seeing, and that was the talk. We watched the expansion into other products. You took the hero SKU and put it into different products and just expanded and really capitalized off of that. So as we're looking, like, it's something that people are noticing too. Not just consumers, it's other brands, and we're like, oh, that's really sticky. So I think, to your point, really using those moments of virality and figuring out how to activate, and to your point, like, innovate in a new way. It doesn't have to be, right, necessarily a new product. So, okay, you spoke a little bit about forecasting, or you mentioned that. I do want to, transition to this next question. What have you learned about forecasting in industries where demand is not only tied to economic cycles, but to cultural trends, brand relevance, and consumer identity?
That's a loaded question. It's a lot there. And there's a lot in terms of the complexity of forecasting today. When you think about, the things that I just spoke about in terms of, how an influencer could all of a sudden, have a product go viral and you run out of stock. And so, when I joined Estée Lauder, the demand planning function was Excel spreadsheets in every market that we operated in. So you think about 25 brands in 150 markets run on Excel spreadsheets. that was not going to sustain the business with all the complexity that was happening as it relates to how the advertising and marketing environment changed. And so we really had to invest in tools to make that process much more sophisticated. And the tools were, not only automated forecasting tools, but tools that could also incorporate a lot of the attributes that were important to really understand. So improving the predictive, outcome of a lot of the tools, and integrating more of the marketing insight. So we know we're going to launch a new product. We know we're going to animate an existing product. How do we think about that from a from a demand planning standpoint? So we had to strengthen a lot of our processes as it related to tools as well as the process itself. Also get a lot more intelligence, from brand rankings, from social media, from a lot of different sources in order to improve the predictive outcome of some of our demand planning processes. So, it was very interesting. The other thing that happened was, when you think about how the company had marketed in the past, there were these big campaigns, that were created by corporate and then distributed, throughout the globe. And part of that thought process for a luxury or prestige company was, we want to keep the brand integrity in place. Mm-hmm. And that model didn't work, throughout, starting 5 or 6 years ago. And so we really needed to be able to enable our local markets to do consumer engagement, consumer marketing, and obviously the forecasting that went along with that. So lots of changes and lots of focus, which again, the engineer in me loved leaning into, to the supply chain processes and some of our marketing analytics processes to really strengthen them to be able to transition in this new environment.
Okay, I think I got one more question. Maybe I can slip it into two. But I know there are a lot of people in the audience just, curious how, like you've gotten here, what's your take on what are some of the skills that they can really lean into? So my next question is, as you think about the future of leadership, mm-hmm. what are some of the capabilities or next generation skills you believe professionals will need in order to succeed in complex environments in corporate?
Prompt engineering for AI. I mean, what companies are looking for right now, again, every board meeting I'm in, certainly a lot of the conversation before I left Estée Lauder was on, the impact of AI on in terms of how it could be a competitive advantage, also what, the impact it's going to have on the business, but how you could make it a competitive advantage. And so a lot of legacy companies are really trying to, training their people, hiring new people that can actually help the company get a competitive advantage. So that is certainly one of the skills. Communication skills are critically important as well. Yeah. Analytical skills, from an insight standpoint, business, one of the things that I think, advantaged me throughout my career was I was always incredibly interested in the industries that I was in. I did a brief stint, as I mentioned, at a company called American National Can. It was the only company that I had worked at that was a non-branded company. And it was very interesting, especially coming from an engineering background, but it was a company that sold to branded companies. So the economics were very different. And so, when I was in automotive, I had the opportunity to drive competitive cars to see how, General Motors cars, the GM Proving Ground, that how their cars compared. When I was at Pepsi, whenever my family and I would go to a grocery store, we'd end up merchandising the Pepsi display. Obviously Ralph Lauren was not, tough at all to get engaged in. When I was at the Limited, we would go into, malls, and I would walk our stores as well as competitive stores. So being heavily engaged and interested in the industry allowed me to approach the finance roles that I had in a much more strategic way. And I think that's, that is helpful to be able to add value in your career, and always be outcome focused. And that's, something that I think as well is very valuable from a career standpoint. Build relationships, take credit, and don't let anybody derail you. As you migrate through your career, you may find that, there are a lot of people that might want to derail you, or, you take away some of your confidence, but always be a continuous learner, and take a stand on positions. And I think that's at least been incredibly important to me in my career.
I love that. I think those are helpful tips. I know someone's taking notes, so I'm going to just borrow that from you all. That I think now we are ready to transition into some questions.
Okay.
Bring in Mike.
Hi. You can speak loud. Yeah.
Sure can.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and obviously, I left Estée Lauder in June of last year, so how they're dealing with that, particular issue, I'm not sure, but I can give you my perspective of how it should be dealt with. AI images are coming, for sure. As you said, they're already out there. I think they need to be identified as AI issues or AI images, so that that this is AI, and and versus using regular images. And I think that's really important. And that's something that I think, from a consumer standpoint, you have to be very careful, because, if a consumer thinks that an image is, in fact, a real person, and they can achieve that look, and it's really an AI-generated image, you run the risk of losing trust with the consumer, to your point. I think you can do both, as long as it's very clear what's what. But it is, to your point, a way to actually get AI images, or a way to get, in a lower cost way, more messaging out there, more images out there. And so I'm all for it, as long as it's very clearly identified that that's what it is. It's difficult today to look at, a site and see an image, unless it's like dancing cats, see an image that, and not know, is that real or not? I think, there are a number of users that are uncomfortable with that. So.
Can you tell us your name? Pam.
Thank you, Kim, for the question.
And everyone else, please, when you ask a question, introduce yourself. You might as well take up the space. You got one over here in the front?
Thanks. Hi, Tracey. I'm Alicia. I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about what you, just when you felt were ready to navigate. You've navigated many different industries, as was mentioned. You're a curious person. You obviously have a valuable skill set. Just from an internal perspective, for gauging for your own leadership, when did you know you were ready to go, and what were kind of the resonant through line of skill sets that were important to develop or use in those transitions?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think, there were different reasons, for different opportunities that I chose to pursue. And when I realized that, either I would say early in my career, I was impatient. Like I said, at General Motors, I had a great career going. General Motors was very hierarchical in terms of movement, and I saw a opportunity, moving to a company like Pepsi, where I could actually progress faster based on my performance. They were very performance oriented. And I, at the time, recognized that, I could have a broader career faster at Pepsi than I did at General Motors. When I left Pepsi, I had been in the general manager role for 4.5 years, and I had taken a market unit that was, as I said, underperforming and turned it around. And so I was actually on a career track to do more sales strategy types of roles at Pepsi, which was great. But then I was approached I was kind of missing my CFO, my finance role. And I was approached about an opportunity to go back into a CFO role, but also, do an IPO and run IT. And once you run information technology, you never get rid of it, by the way. Just a tip. So those were new experiences that I hadn't had. And again, as I thought throughout my career, I'm not actually 100% sure what industry I want to end in and what role I want to end in. So, again, it was an interesting challenge to get some more experience and get back into a finance role. And they were also a company that was really implementing lean manufacturing and Six Sigma. So all that geeky stuff really appealed to me from an engineering standpoint. They actually were acquired. So we did an IPO. They were very quickly acquired by a UK-based company. My role turned into a controller role. And that's when I decided to leave and go to limited brands in retail. So I think, there were different triggers in terms of when I decided to leave and what I decided to leave for. As I mentioned at Ralph Lauren, having been there for 7 years, recognizing that I'm not a merchant and I don't have the brand building experience, even though I, had the finance experience working with a lot of brand leaders and general managers. That I wasn't going to be the CEO at Ralph Lauren. In my role, I had accomplished everything that I had wanted to do. I had helped them bring back 8 different licenses between geographic licenses and product licenses, which was the remit of what I was brought in to do. And an opportunity came along to actually go to a company that was global, had multiple brands. I was 50 at the time. I said, I don't know how much longer I want to work, maybe 10. I started thinking of my career in 10-year increments. And for the next 10 years, what do I want to do and where do I want to do it? And the opportunity with Estée Lauder came along. So I think it's really very personal. There are people that stay with the same company for a number of years and have a great career. I certainly think had I stayed at General Motors, I too could have had a great career, but I was really interested in exploring different industries and different categories, yet leveraging the branding experience that I got in all of those different industries.
Yeah.
It really got to a point, with the finance role that understanding the company's strategy and what they were trying to achieve, assessing my talent and whether or not I had the talent in order to partner with the business in order to achieve that. Really making sure that the analytics were there in the organization to actually help focus on profitable growth and reallocation of resources and all the things that a really top-tier CFO is able to do for an organization. And I was fortunate enough to choose organizations that allowed me to do that. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but it's really a very personal journey. I wish, like I said at the very beginning, that I could tell you it was the master plan, that I knew I was going to accumulate all of these experiences across all these different industries and all these different roles, but it just happened to end up that way. And I think it really helped me in terms of being able to end my career in a role that, encompassed not just finance, but finance and strategy, transformation, IT, investor relations. I co-chaired the operating committee for the company. So it was kind of a quasi COO role, even though I had the CFO title.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm on this side. Hi, Tracey.
Can you wave? I can't see you.
I'm here.
There you are.
Hi,
Okay,
sorry,
yes.
over here on your left.
Yep.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure to hear from you both. My name is Clifford, and I am curious to hear from your perspective I work part-time at Macy's, and I actually work for Estée Lauder. So I was curious to hear your perspective from the C-suite level, or formerly from the C-suite level. I'm curious to hear, in the time that I've been working at Macy's, not necessarily in Estée Lauder, but I've seen a lot of brands enter the store, and some are successful, some are not.
Mhm.
I would be very curious to hear from your perspective. What do you see from or from your vantage point? What makes a successful brand? Because my job is just to sell.
Yeah, no, I mean, we touched on it a little bit, with the indie brand phenomena that has happened in the beauty industry. And look, I had the opportunity with some of my board work as well to, be on the board of Campbell's Soup. You're seeing it in food industry. You're seeing it in a lot of industries, but as it relates to beauty, with lower barriers to entry and a consumer that, is really attracted to experimentation, they're trying a lot of brands. I would say that, and even, part of the strategy at Estee Lauder was to acquire some trendy brands. We acquired Too Faced, we acquired Le Labo, we acquired, a number of different brands. The M&A group also reported into me. Um, you know, two things I think that happen. One is on-trend marketing. So, but the really important thing to me, and certainly to our success from a longevity standpoint, was the quality of the product. The quality of the product, having the right innovation, and having the right messaging with consumers. And that formula, those three, are really what are important. The other thing that's important is distribution. And so obviously Macy's, recognizing that so much of the beauty industry, a lot of the growth was happening in Sephora and Ulta and now Amazon. Macy's, which, where our company had its start in terms of having so much success in the department store channel. Macy's really had to figure out how to broaden their assortment, right, in beauty, as did every other department store across the globe. And so they did introduce a lot of brands, but not investing the type of physical investment that a lot of the legacy brands had with counters. So that recognizing that there's going to be an in and out, and there's going to be churn in in those in that floor space allocation. So. But I mean, that's why our focus on quality was so important, because we wanted repeat. And the real challenge, which I think the company has made some significant strides on, is on the trial, and that really has to do with your marketing strategy. The other thing that we found at Estee Lauder was, as consumers were willing to shop more online, we had to get comfortable not only selling on Macy's.com and Sephora.com and Ulta.com, but selling on Amazon and Kakao in Korea and Rakuten in Japan. Those are online only platforms without a brick and mortar anchor. And that was something, again, that was new to the company. And but we had to very quickly make that decision as more and more brands were showing up on those platforms, particularly the smaller indie brands, and we had to compete. So you need to be where consumers are shopping. And the distribution strategy is a real key one in terms of growth. And the distribution, for beauty has changed dramatically in the last 10 years, and I'm sure it will change again, in the next 5 or 7. So, but you'll be able to, you'll be handling that. I'll be watching.
There you go. The only thing constant is change.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. So that is all the time so sorry. That is all the time we have today. I just want to say thank you again to Tracey for being here. This is really
Thank you. Always a pleasure being back at Columbia.
insightful.
So, thank you.